Good morning, fam. Welcome back. It's that time again. Another episode of Cream, Sugar, and Calmag. So, today we're lucky enough to have a guest coming on, Nick from the Rooted Leaf Agritech. Their organic plant-based nutrient system. Good morning, Jugro. How's it going, buddy? Oh, there we go. And we have our guest joining us now. Should be getting the McDonald's in Canada. Yes, we do. Oh, geez. Good morning, Bloom's Grow Tech. Hello. Good morning, Bloom's Grow Tech. That would be Aaron. He'll be in after 10 a.m. Perfect. Thank you very much. You too. Bye-bye. Okay. Sorry. Had a phone call. Right? There we go. Rooted Leaf is unable to join. I don't think you can join if you're signed into your Instagram through your computer, unfortunately. You might have to go on your phone there. But yes, we're back into our talks about the elements, and today is carbon. And you can see the Rooted Leaf is a carbon-based fertilizer, and we'll get more into that once we get Nick on board here. Just getting this all figured out. There we go. Go live. Is it going to work? We seem to be having technical difficulties this morning.
Hey, look at that. We're good to go.
Are we good? There we go.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. I'm going to turn it sideways that way I don't have to hold it. All right.
All right, cool. Good morning, Nick.
Yeah, good morning. Robin, how are you?
Very good. Welcome to Cream, Sugar, and Calmag.
Thanks for having me on.
There we go. Morning.
Morning.
So today, thank you for joining us. Why don't you start off a bit there with who you are first, and maybe a little bit about the Rooted Leaf and what that's about, which will kind of segue and lead us into our discussion topic of carbon today.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So my name is Nick Nikolaev. I'm the CEO of Rooted Leaf Agritech. We are a carbon-based fertilizer manufacturer here in Washington State. We've been around since April of 2019-ish, so we're still fairly new and fairly young company. But having said that, we managed to develop an interesting suite of technology that utilizes carbon as a macronutrient. And I think the foundational premise for this product line is that it's not so much what you're looking at, it's more how you're looking at it. And I think that if you understand what plants are trying to do with carbon by utilizing the rest of the elements, it kind of stands to reason that carbon should be treated as a macronutrient. So, my background, my professional background is in chemistry. I have some experience with industrial chemistry. I used to do things much different than fertilizer, but Washington legalized the 502 system, which is the recreational cannabis system here in Washington State. That passed, I want to say, like end of 2014, beginning of 2015-ish. People were starting to, kind of get their production licenses together and start cultivating for the recreational market. So, I saw an opportunity because I am from the medical industry as well. I first started growing in about 2008, 2009. So it's been quite a few years for me. But having said that, I just kind of saw this gap in the market where it just seemed like every other product that was out there on the shelf was more or less the same thing, and it kind of adopted more or less the same methodology for how to cultivate plants. And I think cannabis is one of those that's really unique, very interesting to talk about, specifically in terms of how carbon increases and improves quality and yield, just because it's so simple. It's so easy to just point out a couple of things. So I think the best way for us to kind of dive into the topic today is to first look at the simple mechanics of carbon and try to understand what are we even talking about here? What is carbon and how does it fit into the equation if we're just trying to grow some dank wheat, because that's ultimately the most important part. Is if you can't connect with any of the information, it just goes in one ear, it goes out the other. It's useless, right?
Right.
So.
Absolutely. And I don't really think there's much information out there. When I was kind of just scouting out and looking about stuff about the elements for this talks I wanted to do, um, we look at it as, yeah, they breathe it. And that's pretty much where the discussion starts and stops for a lot of us and our knowledge about carbon and what it does for the plant. Though I'm under the impression, like a plant's makeup, when you look at its total weight at the end, a
Mhm.
large bulk of that is carbon.
Mhm.
So it's something we should be paying more attention to if we're looking to, especially commercially, we do this by weight. So it's always going to be a yield thing for us. So,
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, for cannabis, if we were dealing with like tomatoes and corn and things like that, it would be the waters would be more muddied, so to speak, because we're looking at things like grains, which have amino acids and proteins and things like that. So it's not just about carbon. The interesting part here in cannabis specifically is that all monoterpenes are 90% carbon by weight, and all cannabinoids are 80% carbon by weight. And the sesquiterpenes, I believe, are also 88 to 90% carbon by weight. So realistically, if you're growing cannabis, at the end of the day, you're actually just farming terpenes. You're trying to grow flowers that produce an abundance of cannabinoids, terpenes, things of that nature. And those are predominantly carbon by weight. So it stands to reason that if you introduce carbon of a particular form to your plants, that they're going to be able to take that up and then convert it into things that are mostly carbon by weight anyways. It is kind of mechanical in that sense. It is like the square peg fits inside of the square hole. And if you actually think about it, this is why growers have sealed flowering rooms. I've never met anyone professionally or on the medical side that seals a flowering room only to haul the CO2 out. No, they dump the CO2 in. They increase the CO2 concentration.
uh-huh.
And again, it stands to reason that if the plants are producing terpenes and cannabinoids that are 80 to 90% carbon by weight anyways, if you load more carbon onto them, they stand a very good chance of producing more terpenes and more cannabinoids. I think this concept has been fleshed out fairly well across the entire world because these build-outs are very expensive. I mean, think about it. You're putting a heat pump in the form of lights in a sealed room with an air conditioner so that you can water the space only to dehumidify it, right? So if there wasn't a cost to benefit ratio of having all of this gear inside of a sealed room specifically for the purpose of increasing the carbon load on the plants, growers wouldn't spend so much money building it out because they actually do get a lot of money on the back end. Increases in quality, increases in potency, increases in overall yield and biomass. I think anyone that's seriously grown before and grown in a sealed flowering room can tell you it's a no-brainer. Side by side, the plants behave radically different. Even when we're starting to talk about how macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium are metabolized by the plants, it all has a bearing on carbon metabolism in the plants ultimately.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And absolutely, when you run just your little grow tent, you kind of move from that into like a sealed room. It's,
Mm-hmm.
as long as all the other factors, like you have enough light, you have enough, all the other food, everything's increased. So I always like, it's all about balance, right? So,
Yeah, and to that point too, actually, the plants, your cannabis plants try to balance carbon acquisition against the light intensity and against the fertilizer load that they receive. So if you're in a sealed flowering room and you up the CO2, you've also increased your plant's ability to handle a higher light intensity and a higher mineral load intensity. It's called salt-based fertilizer, for lack of a better phrase.
uh-huh.
The macronutrients, NPK, things like that. If you were in a sealed flowering room with 2,000 ppms of CO2 and you had 1,200 ppfd of light on those plants, their appetite would be a lot larger than if you had just, like 400 to 600 watt lights in an open air environment. So as the plants sense the additional carbon, what happens is they're capable of taking up more minerals like nitrogen, let's say in the form of nitrates. This is a good example for us to talk about because there's this interface that occurs where every element must interface with carbon in order to actually become biologically relevant. And I think nitrogen is a good example because if your plants are deficient in nitrogen, you start to see it pretty apparently. The leaves turn yellow because there's a deficiency in chlorophyll and there's probably a deficiency in rubisco, but you can visually just looking at the leaf surface say the plants are deficient
Yeah.
in nitrogen. So what ends up happening is when you water some ammoniacal nitrate or a nitrogen or a nitrate form of nitrogen, what happens is the plants will take that up, and if it's nitrate, it's fully oxidized. It's NO3, so there's a bunch of oxygen that the plant has no interest in whatsoever. So it has to go from this state of being fully oxidized as a nitrate into fully reduced as an amine group. And the amine groups plug into organic acid residues, and those form amino acids. That's, the form amino is kind of a combination of the amine group meeting an organic acid. And the organic acids are entirely intermediate metabolites of carbon fixation. So if you supply the plants with more carbon, they're going to end up making more of these organic acid skeletons that they can then convert nitrates into amine groups and plug those in and get amino acids. So now all of a sudden you have increased protein synthesis efficiency. And this does happen when plants are grown in sealed flowering rooms. The overall protein density goes up, chlorophyll density on the leaf goes up, rubisco density goes up. All of these proteins that are associated with capturing carbon and storing carbon and moving carbon around, all of them go up in the presence of elevated CO2. So again, going back to the nitrogen thing, it's really easy to look at a nitrogen deficient plant because it has yellow leaves, or maybe there's some other characteristic of that cultivar that comes out. With a carbon deficiency, it's not so easy to just say, hey, my plants look like they could be producing more terpenes and more cannabinoids. It's kind of an invisible deficiency, so to speak. So in a lot of times, carbon is a rate limiting factor. The acquisition and the availability of carbon limits the plant's ability to make terpenes and cannabinoids. That's why if you give them more, they make more.
Interesting. And just talking back about the nitrogen and stuff. So then the plant, like, I'm under the understanding that a plant would use like 20% of its energy to convert those nitrates into aminos. And it works. Brandon Rust, I'm not sure if you follow him. He talks about it a lot. And that's like, he's an organic grower in Oklahoma, I believe. And his whole philosophy about his beds is he likes to feed rock dust and then aminos for a nitrogen source. And he says it helps the plants because it's jumping a step versus like nitrates where they have to convert it, right?
Yeah, there's something definitely true about that. I also think, without getting too far into detail, it is kind of a perspective.
Get into detail today. This is going to be saved. And I expect fully myself and others to hit Google after looking up stuff you've talked about. So get into it, mash it up. Maybe after you talk about it technically, we'll just give a little like layman explanation after. But
sure. So I guess there's this kind of overarching, I don't know if it's really a debate. I'm still 32 years old. I'm very young. I'm kind of outside of the conventional standard academic side of things. I just have this outside-in perspective of what people tend to focus on in the academia. And right now there's this focus on this concept of, like, plants at large are split between C3 plants, C4, and CAM plants. CAM plants are like your cacti and things that, grow during the nighttime. Let's just kind of leave it at that. And then C4 plants are things like sugarcane. They have these bundle sheath cells that actually artificially, naturally increase the concentration of CO2 around rubisco. And so they have these distinct advantages in environments that have low carbon availabilities where they can still produce an incredible amount of biomass. So that being said, cannabis is a C3 plant. Most plants on Earth are C3 plants. Something like 95% of plants that have been identified are C3 plants. And the way that rubisco functions in a C3 plant oftentimes leaves people confused. They think there must be some inefficiency, because if you had a motor in a car, for example, that was misfiring 25% of the time, you'd think something's wrong. Time to take it back to the mechanic and fix it. Turns out rubisco does have this sort of inefficiency where it, quote unquote, misfires. But if you look at it in a different perspective, if you look at it from the perspective of C3 plants have evolved a tool to metabolize nitrates specifically, then rubisco starts to become efficient. So that's kind of where I want to leave it. But the bridge I'll connect this to is nitrates are fully oxidized, and ammoniacal nitrogen is fully reduced, meaning it has a bunch of hydrogen and it has that positive charge, the plus sign on it, whereas the nitrate is the NO3 and it has that negative charge on it. So the real difference is, how did the plant go from the extra oxygen to having no oxygen and only hydrogen? Because this process is important, this process of starting off with something that's oxidized and then going to something that's fully reduced. And the energy conversion that happens deals specifically with how carbon in plants is reduced, because just like nitrates, carbon starts off in the air fully oxidized. It's CO2. The
Right.
O2 is the part that the plants don't really need. Um, and in order to deal with it, the plants have to capture energy from the sun through photosynthesis, and then store that electrochemical energy, and then use it to reduce the carbon into a biologically useful form. So if you have monoterpenes are a good example. Actually, I don't know if you have that. If you have the Wikipedia page for a monoterpene handy right now, but it would be good to look at just real quick, because then people can see that it's what's called fully reduced. There's no oxygen inside of a monoterpene, and everyone knows monoterpenes oxidize. So, the plants produce these compounds and try to store them in a form that is not exposed to oxygen, because when you expose it to oxygen, it off gases, becomes volatile. And this happens at normal room temperature too. So the plants are masters at doing this very efficiently. But
So
whatever energy, sorry, go ahead.
just one sec. We got a monoterpene loaded up. So it says monoterpenes are a class of terpenes that consist of two isoprene units and have a molecular formula of C10H16.
Yeah. So that C10H16 is what I'm referring to. That H16 there is the hydrogen that allows this compound to be in a state where it's quote unquote reduced as opposed to oxidized. And so when plants take up nitrates, they start with the oxidized form and they convert it into a reduced form so that amine head group can actually be a functional constituent of an amino acid. C3 plants have evolved this particular affinity for processing high levels of nitrates at the expense of some metabolic advantages, I guess you could say, that C4 plants have with their bundle sheath cells and the way that C4 acid is typically metabolized by the plants. So, all this to say there is some real benefit to understanding how nitrates fit into the natural cycle for plants, particularly for cannabis plants, because if the microbes in the soil are getting exclusively ammoniacal forms of nitrogen, you bet there's some conversion happening. Cannabis plants in some cases prefer to take up nitrates, particularly for photophosphorylation. If you activate P680 and P700 through red and far red light frequencies, just like P450 is a reference to 450 nanometers, which is that blue wavelength of light that activates the cytochrome, which within that cytochrome is contained chlorophyll and rubisco. So all of your photosynthetic proteins are wrapped up in that blue light spectrum, so to speak. Whereas if you're talking about phosphorylation, it's really P680 and P700 that are driving that a little bit more markedly, which is why, most growers, when they go from veg to bloom, they like to put the sods in. The high pressure sodium drives a pathway that's slightly different, still light, yes, and there's still electron transport and communication between P450 and P680. But the point is that
effect, though. The Emerson effect, like when you add 660 light and 720, they work synergistically together. So it's like a 1 + 1 = 3 scenario, and it causes photosynthetic reaction. So
it certainly does become a lot more efficient with that too. And so, with P680 being active, you have this thing called the oxygen evolution complex that's also kind of working in overtime. And the oxygen evolution complex basically is what allows nitrates to be metabolized and then undergo this process of reduction and conversion into a biologically relevant form.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, so that's just one example, because nitrogen is otherwise useless for plants. Unless it's plugged into a carbon-containing structure, it's useless. Even alkaloids have nitrogen, but they're also bound to some carbon or some organic acid residue. So the interface between the macronutrients that people typically think of as being macronutrients and carbon is really where all aspects of primary and secondary growth come from. The same thing is true of, actually with nitrogen real quick, over 50% of all of the proteins that are in your leaves are going to be either rubisco or chlorophyll, particularly for a very intense commercial cultivation environment where you have high light intensity, you have a high amount of CO2, and you're really watering the plants a lot. If you were to take a leaf sample off that plant and analyze it, what you would see is that it produces a lot of chlorophyll, and that chlorophyll is very dense on the leaf. Versus if you had a plant that was grown in a low light environment with not as much intensity overall, you wouldn't see as much chlorophyll density and you wouldn't see as much rubisco density. So it's interesting to me that when you give your plant a piece of nitrogen, the thing it does is it says, oh, cool, here's a tool that I can use to capture more carbon. And that's all they do. Most of the nitrogen that you give your plants, over 50%, goes into either rubisco or chlorophyll, and both of those only have one job, and that's capture carbon out of the air. Well, rubisco technically does. Chlorophyll, participates in capturing energy from the sun, but to what point, right? It's to fix carbon fixation.
Right. And so us really as like your standard cultivator, we're not feeding carbon in the soil. We're not doing it. We're strictly relying on pulling it from the air. How does your line differ, and how does it supplement the plant with extra carbon? Like what, could you just get a little into explaining that really? Because that's, you know what I mean? It's very foreign to us. Like I feed cocoa and I feed bottle feed, and there's no carbon in any of my products I feed, other than like if I carb load with carbohydrates, I assume that would be carbon.
Yep, carbohydrates, definitely, yeah. That is, I'm gonna flip my phone this way real quick. That should work. Okay, there we go.
I think people are happier. Everyone's tilting their phone to look at you.
Yeah, sorry. I was charging my phone, so I had to have it sideways like that.
Happy you're here, Nick.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So,
awesome.
Carbon is so interesting to talk about carbon like a macronutrient, because politically right now on sort of the global stage, carbon is a hot topic. A lot of people don't want to talk about carbon, and they treat carbon like a pollutant for all intents and purposes. But in reality, carbon does oftentimes limit the productivity in most biological systems. So, going back to our product line and the way it was designed and developed, we really engineered this thing from the ground up. Everything is from scratch, including the organic synthesis reactions. When we make our own chelates and complexes and things like that, we're actually starting with the plants themselves that we bring in. And just to kind of back up one step, so our product line consists of 9 products, including an A and a B. We have a foliar spray, we have a Calmag, we've got a nitrogen supplement, so it's kind of standard to what most people in the cannabis industry are used to. There's a PK booster and there's a finisher as well. And we have a fantastic soil conditioner.
Absolutely. Well, hey man, the floor is yours. Like, let's get into each product and talk about how it uses carbon, and like use the is this a podium, man?
Sure. No, I appreciate it. We're gonna geek out. We're gonna get into the technical details.
Awesome. Lay it on us.
So think about it this way: like nitrogen is a good example of an element that it's kind of, nitrogen can be metabolized by plants in a positively charged form and a negatively charged form. It can come in through the air into the soil via the form of nitrogen gas that's then fixed by microbes. Other elements such as phosphorus, very narrow range of availability. We're talking about small pH range of availability. We're talking about it has to be picked up by plants in an inorganic form, yet it exists in the soil where presumably there is organic matter. So when you look at how nutrients kind of metabolize with each other, so to speak, things get very complicated, and it certainly doesn't help to just add carbon on top of that, because carbon chemistry is very, very complex. It's not easy to fully go through it. So the best way to understand this kind of topic at large with what we're doing in terms of carbon chemistry is we're utilizing certain types of carbon, if you will, to drive pathways in plants. We can use carbon to modify how nitrogen is metabolized, for example. People who add amino acids do this all the time. It's the acidic portion, that organic acid portion of the amine, that will modify the way the nitrogen is metabolized. And the more excess organic acid residues you have, the greater the potential for the plant to take up a piece of nitrate or a piece of ammoniacal nitrogen and combine it and condense it into an amino acid. So with that in mind, we're all about removing limiting factors for plant growth. And when we designed this line, the idea was to give the plant something that was 100% bioavailable, that plugged into its metabolic pathways, utilizing the exact same species of carbon, let's call them organic acids at large, that drive these nutrient metabolism pathways in plants. I think Calmag, our Calmag, is actually probably one of the best examples. I see you have your Calmag here, so I had to get this one here, the Calmag Fuel.
Calmag, I remember, because I've tried that. we hooked up a while ago, and it's
Yep.
nitrogen free, isn't it? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's no nitrates, there's no phosphates, there's no sulfates, no chlorides, no animal products, no carbonates. It is entirely a low molecular weight organic acid that's derived from microbes and plants. And the real benefit here is that if you're into organic cultivation and you like living soils and things like that, you probably know that microbes converting nutrients in the soil is a big part of the process. Um, so there's certain types of chemistries that microbes undertake in the soil to fix the nutrients for the plants to make them available for the plants. And so part of our manufacturing techniques revolve around those natural chemistries that are present in the soil. You know, how do the microbes and the plants naturally interact, and what are the compounds that are produced that actually become substantive nutrition? So with that as our focus, we kind of got to this interesting spot where the pH of our product doesn't matter. It could be very low, like 4.5, 4.6. In some cases, probably a little closer to 4.0, and the plants don't get burned because those complexes that we make there, those substances are available to synthetic
Oh,
pathways. So with Calmag in particular,
well, you paused on us for a sec there, Nick.
oh, okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, no, you're back.
Okay, cool.
See, and
Okay,
that's
so
all about relation too, right? Like, I'm a big fan of humic acid and fulvic acid, which is another carbon molecule, correct?
mhm.
And like my understanding is like humic acid's very good at making things more available, as where fulvic acid boosts that chelation and uptake of it. So
Yeah. So the humics are a good thing to talk about too, because we're looking at speciation of carbon. What carbon is long chain and insoluble for plants,
uh,
stays in the soil, and it has what are called polyanionic charges, meaning multiple negative charges. And if you think in relation to the CEC of the soil, the cation exchange capacity, the cations are balanced out by the anionic charges on the humic. And so a lot of times people think humic will hold calcium and magnesium and potassium more available for the plants. And it's specifically because of these anionic charges that are present on the surface of the humic portion. And yes, I just read one of the messages from PNWC Seeds here, our buddy Andy. Yeah, so the real benefit to humic is, again, you want to use something that's not oxidized. You want to use something that hasn't been exposed for millions of years to the oxygen and to weathering and to developing cracks, because this oxidation reduces the ability of the humic to hold the charge. And then same thing if you, yeah, C14H1208. So technically there is no agreed upon or formal definition of what a fulvic or what a humic
right.
really is. Yeah. Fulvic acids, I believe, are a little bit more complex than that. I think their molecular weight is just a little bit higher. So that's a really simple.
Right. It was just a quick Google search. I was just kind of curious. Oh, and
That's
there's
more accurate, honestly. There, with the longer amount of carbon that's in there, probably around 100. So with humics, it's not so much just looking at that formula and saying, oh well, that can describe it, because with humics, what happens is that oxygen is often cyclized, and so it has a lot of it's a ring structure, it's an aromatic structure, and the aromatic structure has these bonds in it that are really, really hard to break. And so it's fantastic if you want to put that in the soil and have it condition the soil for years, because it doesn't break down. It just allows things to pass by it, right? The
right.
charge holds a piece of calcium, and then that's released to the plant as the plant grows.
Like a proton pump, sort of.
Yeah. And so you have these aromatic functional groups. Well, technically, they're structural groups, not functional groups inside of humic. You have methoxy, for example, and that's contributes to the structure of a soil. The fulvic acid has very few of these aromatic structures, very few rings. Most of it is like a long chain or a tail. If you've seen a picture of a THC molecule, it has that diterpene little wiggle at
Yeah.
the end. So that is the kind of the functional equivalent, or the analog there is, think about fulvics like being aliphatic. They're just long chains. And think about humics like being aromatic, which means they're cyclized, they have rings. And that ring structure contributes to soil integrity and soil stability, whereas that linear property of fulvic acids allows it to actually take stuff up in through the transpiration stream and incorporate it. It's been shown, for example, fulvic acids will inhibit the oxidation of auxins. As the auxins, which are primary growth hormones, are traveling from cell to cell, they have this apical dominance thing. They start off in the meristematic tissue
Uh-huh.
and they work their way down. And as they work their way down between the cellular compartments, they're exposed to types of stressors that could potentially break these compounds down. Auxin in its natural form is indole-3 acetic acid, so it is an organic acid technically. It's a species of carbon that the plants rely on to transmit certain types of information that dictate whole plant growth. So you can imagine if this messenger breaks down in the process of transferring the message, that you're going to get some weird stuff happening with the plant growth. So in this way, fulvic acid has been shown to help prevent the oxidation of auxins as they do their job in the plants naturally. They've also been shown to complex minerals like magnesium, for example, and calcium to some extent. I think potassium is probably the easiest one to get picked up. But they have all of these very useful properties that are hard to talk about if we just look at the fact that they contain carbon. There's a
Right.
lot more going on. It's very multi-dimensional. So,
They're a
you know,
biological molecule, right?
yeah,
Almost.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it really does change the way that other nutrients are metabolized. I mean, going back to our Calmag and Calmag fuel, we don't use nitrates for it. And so when the plants pick it up in the transpiration stream, they recognize it as a different type of calcium. We use a lot of orange peel when we make our Calmag, and the orange peel contains pectic acid residues that are fantastic for helping plants repurpose some of these cross-linked sugars that they would otherwise use to make cell walls anyway, so we can just give them a little bit of the best thickest cell wall there is, basically orange peel. The plants end up accumulating that calcium and they put it into the cell walls with a higher degree of efficiency than they would the nitrates, because we give them fully reduced carbon and our calcium as well as reduced. There's no nitrates inside of it, and so the plants don't have to process fully oxidized form of a macronutrient and then convert it into a fully reduced form at the expense of reducing carbon. We don't have to do that with the plants. And so there's this entire step that's taken out of the equation. The plants can literally take it up passively. They recognize it as something they themselves would naturally produce anyways, and they say, well, I'm going to put you in the cell wall then, because there's not much post translocational modifications that have to happen. It already exists in a naturally recognized complex form derived from plants, derived from microbes. There's no animal products inside of it, so there's no conversion that has to happen. There's no structures in there that are foreign for the plants. These are all very useful substrates that we can use to act on how certain nutrients are metabolized in general. Calcium is a great one. Certainly the other elements are like that too. I think phosphorus is probably one of the trickiest ones to talk about, just because its release from the soil is guided by inorganic chemistry. Plants take up orthophosphate, and they can't have carbon attached to it as far as we know so far. I mean, I'm sure there's some research being done, and some people are trying to figure out ways to maybe deliver a broader spectrum of phosphorus nutrition. But generally speaking, orthophosphates do not contain carbon. And then when the plants utilize phosphorus, they, again, just like nitrogen and just like magnesium, the phosphorus has to meet carbon somewhere. Typically, it's in the form of phosphate sugars. So when your plants photosynthesize, they suck CO2 out of the air, just like, I guess, a vacuum cleaner would. They have an enzyme that physically sucks the CO2 out, and it tries to compress it or condense it into a phosphate sugar.
Hmm.
And you and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. Growers that are in high light intensity environments with high CO2 rooms, they have their plants have an inherently higher appetite for magnesium and for phosphorus, because magnesium and phosphorus are the interface, the enzymatic interface, where carbon becomes biologically relevant. It gets sucked out from the air as CO2, and then it gets physically dissolved and solubilized inside of the plant tissue. And that step is very important. We want to take a look at the mechanics of it, because most growers are probably finding themselves in situations where they are carbon deficient and they just don't know it. Because with nitrogen, it's really easy to tell. Your plants will show you that they're deficient in nitrogen. But if you could have had 4% terpenes and you only got 3, how would you know? The plant's not going to show you some physical sign of being stressed out or being under fertilized.
Right. And they're really I've heard, if you get down to 150 ppm of CO2, that point, your plant will actually will it show a deficiency or will it just die?
So around 100 ppms, let's say maybe 150. Rubisco and C3 plants stops operating efficiently, and Rubisco, it has, like, like my hand. I'm trying to, let's say I was trying to grab a baseball, right, and I didn't exactly know what I was grabbing, so my hand just reflexively does this and is trying to grab something. So Rubisco in plants is kind of like that, where it's trying to grab CO2, but
Uh-huh.
every once in a while it won't grab CO2. It'll grab oxygen instead, and it takes oxygen through the same process, but oxygen doesn't have carbon inside of it, so it's not useful. So the plants end up um, working against themselves, so to speak, on that. So the ability for Rubisco to differentiate between carbon and oxygen at such a low concentration is what prevents that CO2 from like sticking into the hand of the CO2 as it's trying to grab, or the Rubisco is trying to grab the CO2 out of the air. Um, on the flip side, with higher concentrations, it becomes easier for the plants to do that just because there's more carbon present in the air, less oxygen present overall. And so the plants have an easier job. Interestingly enough, what you just talked about was one of the differences I pointed out with C3 plants and C4 plants. C4 plants have these bundle sheath cells where even if the concentration of CO2 in the regular, let's say out here right now, it was 100 ppms outside,
Uh-huh.
C4 plants would have a mechanism by which they could concentrate the quantity of CO2 for Rubisco, and therefore they can grow at much lower concentrations of CO2 environmentally before they start to get affected in such a negative way.
Interesting. Very interesting. Cool.
Yeah. So, like you were talking about with decreasing the CO2 load on a plant, yeah, the plants would suffer. They would not. You could measure. Let's say you had some ultra advanced piece of machinery that you just press a button and it measures every possible metabolite in the plants. Just for the sake of hypothetical argument here, if you had your light intensity dialed in and you had the EC level of the salts dialed in and all the macronutrients for all intents and purposes, if those things were kind of dialed in and the only throttle that you were adjusting was the CO2, what you would notice is if you decrease the CO2, all aspects of primary and secondary metabolism come to a grinding halt. The plants, if they're not capable of taking up carbon, they have no sink for the nitrogen that you give them. And so now all of a sudden they're in a state of being in excess of the nitrates, let's say, or the phosphates or the sulfates or something that doesn't have carbon. The plant's trying to balance out all of that stuff against the carbon load that's coming in through the leaves. And so on the flip side, instead of decreasing, if you were to increase the CO2 concentration, at some point you would find that the plants become deficient in mineral fertilizers. In other words, they need more because the added carbon load is creating a scenario where they have access to resources that they can use to condense that piece of ammoniacal nitrogen with this organic acid over here and make an amino acid. And this is why with elevated CO2 concentrations, things like protein synthesis go up, because this combination of the minerals that you give them with the carbon that you give them, they do meet in the middle. And the plants end up producing compounds that are that contain both, and they require both. Now, carbon is the one that is interesting because plants, as you said at the very beginning of this, if you were to take the dry weight of pretty much any plant at the end of it, well, maybe with the exception of like horsetail and other plants that may accumulate some other elements, but by and large, for all intents and purposes, cannabis, all the food crops that you eat, that humans depend on, they're mostly carbon by weight. And so all of this NPK, calcium, magnesium, those are just tools that the plants use to capture more carbon. Again, going back to the nitrogen thing, over 50% of all the nitrogen you put on your plants ends up in one of two proteins, and both of those proteins are involved in carbon fixation. One of them is, well, that's its only job, Rubisco. It's the only thing it does. It fixes carbon. And chlorophyll also very important. So this interesting thought process occurs to me where it's like, you're giving your plants nitrogen, and they're telling you they're going to take that nitrogen and grab more carbon out of the air. Okay, well, what happens if you give them more magnesium? The active site of chlorophyll is magnesium ion, and the active site of Rubisco is also magnesium. So magnesium is quite literally at the interface where carbon from the air in the form of CO2 meets carbon in the form of a phosphate sugar in the plants. So even though magnesium is considered a micronutrient, it has a very disproportionately large impact on carbon metabolism. And so you can think to yourself, if you are in a room with higher light intensity, it stands to reason you would give the plants more nitrogen because you want more chlorophyll.
Right.
You also give them more magnesium because you want more rubisco activity. You want more of that CO2 that you dump in the air to be sucked down into the plant tissue. And the interface for that is magnesium. Magnesium at the center of rubisco and magnesium at the active site of chlorophyll. And even the phosphate sugars that are involved in the sinking of that carbon. And then from there, it's all anabolic metabolism from there. I
Uh,
should say too.
could I just stop you there? I just wanted to,
Yeah.
like, with have you noticed any difference in growing in HBS under full spectrum? Because I learned that when you feed plants a full spectrum of photons, including all the spectrum, they're able to photosynthesize at a higher rate and do more chemical reactions versus just like a narrow band like HPS where it's like 20 CRI or something.
Yeah, there is a benefit certainly to full light spectrums. Plants have all kinds of antenna pigments, if you will. Chlorophyll is just one of them that senses one particular wavelength of light. You have carotenoids that sense a different wavelength of light. You have
And the like
anthocyanins.
the 500 range, right, is in the green bands where you get your carotenoid production.
Yeah, it's like that kind of greenish orangish. I always think carotenoids, carrots, orange. You
Yeah.
know,
All that.
uh, fun fact for you, I do think this is not confirmed. It's just amusing of mine. Carotenoids are oh shoot, not diterpenes. Try tetraterpenes. Yeah. My brain's a little slow today. So they have 40. All carotenoids have 40 carbon units, and it seems like enzymatically plants, cannabis plants particularly, have tools that they can use to snip those carotenoids in half and then create two diterpenes out of it. And it turns out that carotenoid catabolism can give rise to certain substrates. I don't know if they convert all the way back to isoprene, which is that 5 carbon building block, but then they get their monoterpenes, which are the 10 carbon building blocks. Sesquiterpenes are one and a half, so 15, and then diterpenes like cannabinoids have 20 carbons or 21 for cannabinoids.
Super interesting, man. So like when I started, wanted to get in full spectrum light, like I've only been growing since 2016, but that was when the whole like LED movement and stuff was going. I couldn't afford LEDs, so I went with the next thing down. I went with CMH. And then if you look at the testing with CMH, it's seeing side by side HBS versus LED versus CMH. And the CMH always has the highest cannabinoids at the end when you do the testing. And I always attribute to that to, was it maybe the UV or, you know what I mean? But there is a huge spike in the middle where you have that green and orange and whatnot. And lots of people get like, oh, it's useless and whatnot. Like, or plants don't use green light or something like that, right? But in the end, we're finding cannabinoids are higher when we grow with that full spectrum. And then that comes like what you were saying about magnesium. Like a lot of LED guys, when they start getting into it and LEDs start coming along and we're starting pushing the light intensity, the same PPF that HPS is doing, but because it's full spectrum, we're like, holy shit, our plants are fucking hungry. Like, you know, red stalks, I'd never get this under HPS and whatnot, right? But that's where it's coming back, like the plants need more magnesium. And I talk with people, and so I'm a cultivator. I don't have this sort of schooling and background you do, but I look at stuff and it's kind of like I do it and I see the results and I try and keep a variable simple. And like red stalks, it plagues a lot of us, especially if you're trying to grow in a high PPF. And I can change nothing except I'll add my PK boost or start it sooner, and that always seems to correct it. And I talk with nutrient companies and they're like, no, it's not phosphorus, it's some micronutrient, or it's this, that, or the other. But no, that kind of makes sense with what you're saying.
Yeah, there's a host of what are called post-translational modifications. So when you have proteins that are made in plants, after they're made and they're exported and they start doing their work, sometimes these workers themselves get modified so that the work they do within the plant changes slightly. So these modifications, one of those is called phosphorylation. And this is the concept of how phosphorus is recycled in plants fits into here in these phosphorylation cycles, because phosphorus is recycled within plants. It's not something that, like calcium becomes a piece of the cell wall, and nitrogen becomes a constituent of the protein that sits in the leaf.
like
Phosphorus.
like polysaccharides, right? Everything's either oh geez, a starch or cellulose, or was it glycerine?
Uh, like
Sorry,
yeah, no,
Elmo.
no worries. We'll get into sugars and the there's a structure function relationship between certain types of sugars and the beneficial effects that they've been shown to elicit in terms of plant resistance to biotic and abiotic stress. I think anyone that's applied kelp extract as a foliar spray knows what I'm talking about. And there is some level of truth that revolves around the specific types of sugars that are produced by kelps. So, shoot, I forget where were we at. Where was
Ah,
what were things come out
it's
there?
like people are loving this, and man, we'll get you on all the time. We'll make you regular.
It was we were talking about something about phosphorus. Oh yeah, phosphorylation. Yeah. So there's yeah, I don't know. It's tough because these problems, there's typically any grow is so complex that you have so many variables happening. It's impossible to just reduce it down to one and say that, aha, this is the thing. It's a combination of all things in general. Going back to your original question to answer the question about metal halide and the cannabinoid expression that you get, my understanding of that is partially to do with UV lights and also partially because the terpene synthase enzymes, the proteins themselves that are responsible for making terpenes, are activated by blue light right around 450 nanometers. Their activity starts to go up. I think one of the best examples of this is chlorophyll, because chlorophyll does have a diterpene alcohol that sits, it's literally the tail portion of it. You have the porphyrin ring at the center that actually catalyzes the reaction, and then you have what appears to be a little tail that floats down. And that tail is actually what extends chlorophyll and allows it to actually capture energy from the sun and then move that energy down through there. So point being ultimately is there is some level of terpene biosynthesis that is fundamentally tied to chlorophyll biosynthesis. And we all know that chlorophyll biosynthesis is tied to blue light a little bit more strongly than red light. But that being said, there's so much crosstalk between these pathways and various light spectra that even something as simple and benign as green light, like it's been shown that green light, in the presence of green light, plants actually fix CO2 a little bit more efficiently, just at a very particular layer of their photosynthetic apparatus. It doesn't happen, I think it happens in like the spongy mesophyll layer of the cell wall. It doesn't happen in the active sites of rubisco. So this just goes to show you that, hey, in the presence of green light, somehow the amount of carbon fixed by the plants can go up, even though we tend to think that green light has nothing to do with primary metabolism. And certainly, if anything, it actually induces a shade stretch growth response in the plants where they perceive that they're being outshaded because all of the light that filters is caught, or all of the light that that the leaves, quote unquote, want for the purpose of primary and secondary metabolism
Right.
is, and then the green light comes through. So if you have one leaf above the other, the bottom leaf receives a very particular message in the form of the light spectrum. It's getting just that one band because everything else has been filtered out. So the plants will naturally stretch.
Right, and I find basically after like 3 or 4 layers of fan leaves, like most usable light has, that's why I do my strip tech. I do kind of like people I've been out talking to lately, consulting. I like to lollipop up, and then I do what's called tutu tech, where I leave a tutu on the plant. And
Sure.
I strip from the cola tops down, and I strip the top 2/3, and I leave like a band of fan leaves, but about 3, 4 layers thick, because after that, like the usable light is, tailoring off, right?
Yeah, and it's really about the efficiency of the proteins that are involved in there. If you've got some considerable amount of nitrogen that's sunk into proteins that are not really active and photosynthesizing, you're not really going to get much efficiency. Yeah, you can burn 1,000 watts all day, but if your PPFD is 150 at that level, the rubber's not meeting the road.
Right. See, and I'm all about directing plant energies. Like
Yeah.
that would be the horticulture aspect of it. But that's like in the beginning, I do what's called like one noting, where I lollipop all the branches and leave like 1 or 2 nodes at the top. Give 2 days and then flip the flower. I like to about end of week 2, I like to clean the bottoms up again and redirect that energy towards the top. And then, like lots of guys would be like, like the larvae or the suckers or whatnot. And that's true. You're pulling energy, plant energies away from where we want it as the cultivator. And it's
Mhm.
funny, like, we're learning so much now. And when you think about like the old school guys, like the green light, for example, plants can't see that. But, I've had friends now like, oh, this plant hermed. Like, what was different? Well, there was a green light beside it. It shouldn't affect it, but apparently it did, right? Or when
Mhm.
we're talking about like the blues, and you're talking about blues and far of cannabinoid production and stuff. Look at all the old school growers. What did they used to do? Last week they threw in a 10K finishing bulb, right? Which was like super blue, but they didn't know the science behind it. But somewhere, some guy tried it out and was like, "Hey, look at what this does," and it like, my shit's way frostier this round and whatnot. So it's
Yeah.
there's so many factors, right? But
Mhm.
we're getting totally off track. Let's get back to carbon. Let's talk about another one of your products, uh, solar rain. I know it's popular. I know a lot of people like to use that foliar.
Yeah, Solar Rain's great. It is our flagship product. The chelate that we make for it is very special. It does some pretty unique things that we're still trying to fully wrap our heads around to try to figure out what it is that we're doing as far as benefiting the primary growth of the plants. So it is a magnesium-based foliar spray, and the extractives that it contains are from green tea, which we actually get some very high-quality matcha to make it. Matcha is rich in L-theanine, which is a kind of a unique amino acid in the context of plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. So I think over the next couple of years, you'll see more and more agricultural companies at large start to adopt L-theanine as one of the amino acids. It does have some interesting properties. And then the other one is safflower. We derive some pigments from safflower, and they, interestingly enough, are really good at absorbing oxidative stress in that sort of carotenoid frequency range. Let's call it the 500-ish to 600-ish. So they do a good job of soaking up stress for the plants like that. So what we do is, for solar rain, for all intents and purposes, it does, the best way that I can describe it is that it effectively replaces the function of a leaf. Because think about a leaf like a giant solar panel. All it's trying to do is capture energy from the sun and then use the energy that was captured to power a process that would be used to create some sugars, let's say, or to create some terpenes or something like that. Maybe some cannabinoids are in the mix too. So in reality, it's about exposure to the light and then the subsequent capturing of that light energy to reduce carbon or to fix carbon. So if you're Solar Rain is a really good product that works very well if you're underpruning the plants or if you're lollipopping the plants, because when you're removing those photosynthetic sites, if you snip the plants and trim them and prune them and then spray Solar Rain, what you're doing is effectively sinking as much carbon as, let's say twice as many leaves that you just stripped off are capable of fixing. Because we have so much carbon in that product that when you spray it on the leaves, it's effectively doing the job of what the leaves would normally be doing, which is capturing carbon using electrochemical energy to power this whole process. It's very, very complex too. So I don't mean to, um,
No,
reduce it or simplify it, but it's very, very complex.
people can Google shit after. I know
Yeah.
I.
So, when you spray solar rain on the leaf surface of your plants, there's a lot of organic acids that come in that are specific for primary and secondary metabolism. They kind of fit just like a key in a lock type of metaphor. We have these organic acids that plug right into the pathways that plants naturally go down in order to do things like make new leaf tissue or to capture more carbon out of the air. So it's good when we combine certain cultivation methodologies with our customers, like people who do like to underprune their plants and to keep them shaped and structured a certain way.
Mhm.
They always come back over the top with a foliar spray of solar rain, and there is no stress that the plants experience whatsoever because the net carbon gain for them just went through the roof. You decreased the overall surface area for carbon fixation, but you gave them so much carbon that they might as well have had 3 or 4 times the surface area to fix all of that. I guess I should mention real quick too that one of the unique aspects of or the chelate that we make and the complex that we make at large for solar rain is one that it's been shown to induce chlorophyll biosynthesis with a high degree of efficiency. And so we're capable of giving the plants with this product a type of magnesium that it can recognize intake and then squeeze out a molecule of chlorophyll with relatively low amounts of energy needed to further convert that magnesium and then get it to a spot where it can be plugged into chlorophyll. I think it's like the insertion of magnesium is the seventh and final step of chlorophyll biosynthesis. From what I recall, it's been a couple of years, but this insertion of magnesium into the active site of chlorophyll is something that is very intriguing in the context of foliar sprays because the chlorophyll is biosynthesized on the leaf surface. And so it's a shortcut to spray something that's a direct precursor for chlorophyll that allows the plants to, as soon as it touches the leaf surface, the plants are passively taking up that chelate and that complex. There's no enzyme that has to go and do work. There's no scissors, molecular scissors that have to be taken. The plants literally absorb it, just like I would drink water and absorb that into my body. It's not like eating a steak where I have to break that protein down and get it to a useful form. It's baby food for the plants, basically.
Right. Sounds super efficient. I'm all about efficiency. Anything you can do to maximize your plant's ability and not waste energies elsewhere goes towards like improvements in yield or like secondary metabolites and stuff like that. So sticking on the subject of foliars, I remember when you sent that to me, you had a thing about when to actually foliar.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about that because when you apply your foliar will have different effects on the plant, correct?
Yeah, certainly. And that also has to do with
that isn't readily out there. And so lay it on us, man. Let's talk. Like, so with this, when should we be applying it? And, you know, what would we see different if we applied it at different times?
Well, so if you were to apply solar rain at the very beginning of the morning when the plants first wake up, you know, really realistically for the first hour to hour and a half, if you have a time-lapse camera or time-lapse photography set up in your grow room, just look at the day and night cycles. You'll see that when the plants first wake up in the morning, they do a majority of the actual physical and stretching and growth, let's say in the first 2 hours. You know, the leaves start off kind of wilted like this, and then they sort of raise, but then the plant physically lifts too. And then the next day.
A caveat to that is like getting to light recipes. 7:30, you can put your plants to sleep like that immediately, as opposed to having them sit awake 2 hours in the dark in the grow room. It's from how they evolved to get that far red at sunset. It puts them to sleep. But in the morning, you can actually wake them up with 660 because they're not photosynthesizing at a high rate for the first couple hours either. So that's another thing kind of cultivators are getting onto is improving the efficiency of your plants operating. I'm not sure if that would affect the growth they would do in the first couple hours, but
it would. It certainly would. Yeah, and you know, the grand purpose at large for the first couple hours, as far as what the plants are doing, is it's more about sensing the environment and getting ready for the day, so to speak. I mean, they're kind of waking up. They're kind of getting used to it. They're doing a lot of sensing as far as figuring out like what's the access to water like. Let's put it this way: if you're in your garden and the lights are just about to turn on, and you know your plants are thirsty, if you water them before the lights turn on and before the plants actually kind of get into the swing of things, what you're going to find is that the plants are regulating their internal chemistries much different in the presence of that water. They know the water's there, they can sense it, and they're starting to kind of get ready to take that water up and do something useful with it. Whereas on the flip side, if your plants wake up and they need water, they're going to be in the state of downregulating their growth. A dry plant does not grow nearly as well as a plant that was just watered.
Right,
you know?
right.
So it just goes to show you that there are sensors. Plants do have sensors. All of these pigments like chlorophyll, those are sensors. They sense a particular frequency of light. Chlorophyll does its own thing. Carotenoids do their own thing. Anthocyanins, chromophores, so on and so forth, phytochromes, et cetera, they all do their own things. And similarly, there's other types of sensors. Maybe they have nothing to do with light intensity. Maybe they have more to do with carbon availability, or maybe it has more to do with water availability or the availability of certain types of elements. So, yeah, when you do foliar sprays in the morning of our product Solar Rain, you're going to improve the plant's ability to photosynthesize for that day. All aspects of primary metabolism are going to go up. We've given them the organic acids that are a shortcut. They don't have to reduce the carbon from the air, and they don't have to consolidate that carbon into a sugar form or organic acid form. We have the precise organic acids plants would use for their own metabolic purposes anyways. Put it this way, you could give our chelate to a plant, and the plant would not be able to discern whether it was a chelate that it itself made or it was us in a lab making it. That's how precise we're capable of getting with some of these chelates. They plug perfectly into the metabolic pathways. So again, in the morning time, you spray the plant's going to respond. Let's say you're halfway through the day, you walk into your garden and you realize, oh crap, one of my growers forgot to water just one plant. Every other plant's looking great, but this one in the middle right here, directly underneath the lights, it's starting to get crispy. So a couple of strategies there that can be employed. Some growers would turn down the light intensity, maybe move that plant away from directly underneath the intense light, because the benefit there is as the light intensity goes down, the plant is capable of buffering out its limited supply of the macronutrients and carbon as well. So if you were to take this plant and you were to spray it with solar rain, it could be halfway through the day. And what you're doing is you're giving the plant building blocks which soak up oxidative stress that it's subject to in the absence of the building blocks that it needs when it's sitting under such a high intensity environment. So if your plants are stressed in any way, whether it's transplant stress or shock of any kind, or if it's just, oh crap, the gardener forgot to water one plant. You can use solar rain as a tool to alleviate those types of stressors. And again, going back to this, kind of this concept that we have, do as nature is, the plants would otherwise produce certain types of organic acids that would be useful in the context of soaking up oxidative stress, for instance. And so if we give that profile of organic acids to the plants and it is incapable of discerning whether it made it or we made it or what happened, it doesn't matter. It takes in these organic acids and it starts to use them as sponges, so to speak, which soak up all of the stress. And then the plant's metabolism returns back to normal, where it's not running so hot anymore. Some of these pigments can be formed, like anthocyanins, for instance, I should say that they can be formed in response to certain types of light intensity and certain types of light stress. So if the plant is struggling to deal with the light intensity and you give it a precursor for that pigment, it can then make the pigment that will help it return to that state of balance where, yeah, you can have that same light intensity, but now it's got that layer of sunscreen, let's call it, and that sunscreen will soak up that light-induced stress and prevent, some bad reactions, some reactive oxygen species from forming within the vascular tissue.
Running a little low on time here, but let's make it through solar rain today. So what would happen if we applied our foliar like midday?
Think about visually, just imagine you're spraying a plant and the lights turn off. The compounds that you just sprayed on the plant are going to travel their way down through the leaves, and they're quite literally going to explode out of the roots. And this is a good thing because plants naturally at nighttime will close the stomata. And to go back one step, during the day when the lights are on, you water the plants, they take it up through the roots and they push it out of the leaves because there's a pressure gradient there. The lights basically act like a wick to help pull moisture out of the leaf tissue of the plant. At nighttime, that pressure gradient is reversed because the lights are off, the stomata close, but there's still a pressurized flow of water inside of the plant. And so what happens is the phloem tissue starts loading up all of the photosynthates, the byproducts of the day's work, let's call it, and it starts transporting that down to the roots. So at nighttime, the roots start to become a little bit more active. They actually secrete organic acids and they push out some residual water. It's kind of like a heartbeat where the roots will push out certain types of compounds that are meant to dissolve nutrients, so that the next morning when the lights turn back on and that pressure gradient starts going up again, the roots will suck back in everything that they dissolved the night before. And then that same day, or that following night, the same process happens. The roots excrete organic acids, they excrete flavonoids. This is very complex chemistry that people still have, there's so much left to learn. But what I'll say is this, that when plants produce certain compounds during the day, they do so specifically with the intention of feeding microbes in the soil. And you can watch these photosynthates work their way from the leaves to the roots. The microbes are fed. They convert nutrients like minerals, for example, maybe a piece of iron for the plant, and they exchange it with the plant. And so the plant is capable of conditioning which microbes it wants to have help out in the process of day-to-day life. And again, with solar rain at nighttime, if you spray it, those organic acids will literally explode out of the roots in a good way. They'll help solubilize, they'll help stabilize minerals and nutrients for the plant. They will also help stabilize the beneficial microbial populations because we're giving the carbon to those microbes in the form of organic acids, in the form of sugars, that we both extract and that we react ourselves. These sugars are a shortcut for your plant, so your plant isn't taxed the carbon load that it would otherwise be taxed. And in some cases, it can be up to 25% of the overall carbon load that's produced does not feed your plants. It feeds just the beneficial microbes. So the idea here is, well, I wonder what would happen if we took care of the microbes so that the plant didn't have to. And then furthermore, I wonder if we gave the plant the specific building blocks, very specific to very particular pathways that also come from plants and microbes. Can we change or better influence the expression of things like terpenes, which are ultimately mostly carbon by weight anyways? And I think the answer to that is yes. So, man, we really have to have another one of these so that we can kind of get into it.
100%, because we keep getting on topic. I think we've only covered 2 of your products. Definitely will have you back. Honestly, if you want to be a regular guest and come on, I'm looking at people like you're blowing minds here and stuff. And yeah, to the people I have asked, this will be saved. I post these every day. And so go watch, pause, Google, YouTube, back. You know, it's going to take probably a couple times for a lot of this to soak in, myself included, but absolutely. And, you know, I've known you for a couple of years on here, and you've always blown my mind when we talk in the DMs and stuff. And 100%, dude, 100%. Oh, we covered like spraying in the morning, and we covered spraying in the day. What about just prior to lights off? Any benefits?
Yeah. Yep, and that would be specifically with the root growth, the conditioning of soil microbes, the overall structuring of that whole process, and to kind of leave it on a cliffhanger, so to speak. Globally, the focus on carbon right now is to find ways to return carbon to the soil.
Sequestering.
Yeah. Sequestration, yes. And so when you're looking at fertilizers, particularly liquid fertilizers, you really want to make sure that they are coming with some portion of carbon that's soluble in the mix, because otherwise the plants are missing everything that they ultimately revolve around. Any nitrogen you give them is going to be relevant to carbon metabolism. Same thing with magnesium, phosphorus, potassium. We'll get into all this stuff in the future, but carbon is everything to the plants. And so if your fertilizer doesn't have carbon, you're probably inadvertently creating a carbon deficiency in the plants. So,
wow. Yeah. What about at night? We'll just kind of get that as the last thing. Spraying at night, because lots of people don't like spraying with the lights on and all. They're all like, oh, I wait till the lights go off and then I spray. Is that going to same effect? We're going to be feeding our microbes, or are we doing something different then?
Yeah, you would be feeding the microbes. Because the lights are off, the liquid takes longer to dry on the leaf surface. And I think a lot of people are concerned with doing foliar sprays during the day, because as the liquid dehydrates, what they realize is the piece of mineral, let's say it's a piece of magnesium, is not truly bioavailable for the plants. And so the concentration of liquid leaves, but the presence of the salt remains. And so what ends up happening is the salt quite literally falls out of solution. You can have a piece of magnesium in a gallon of water and spray that on your plants, but eventually that gallon of water is going to evaporate, it's going to wick, it's going to go away, it's going to dry off, it's going to do something. So your volume of water reduces, but the presence of that magnesium stays. And you find this a lot with calcium sulfate actually based foliar sprays, is the calcium will dry out and turn into a thin, crusty layer on the outside of the leaf surface. And that's where you get some phytotoxicity, because you're dealing with polymerized calcium sulfate. You're not dealing with a true bioavailable complex for the plants. You can spray our solar rain under full 1,000 watts of lights, and the plants will not get burned, because there's phytotoxicity. It's a bioavailable form of nutrient for the plants anyways. So you may, get a very small amount. Like if you're 2 inches away from the plants and you got 1,500 watt LEDs and you're really just trying to cook the plants, I mean, yeah, sure, you're gonna burn them, but for practical intents and purposes, you're not gonna burn using our products. So having said that, you can apply at nighttime with the lights turned off, but I think you're gonna get a lot more bang for your buck during the day. So just as a really quick closing note, if any of you guys watching this want to, feel free to reach out. Just go on the Rooted Leaf, that's our Instagram account, or check out rootedleaf.com. You can send us an email. I'll probably end up responding to you. So if you guys want to have a conversation and start the dialogue about carbon, feel free. We love to talk to people about this stuff. So I appreciate you letting us on for just over an hour, and we're definitely looking forward to the next one. There will be more.
This was I'm sure you blew a lot of minds and opened a lot of eyes and get people thinking in a way they haven't really thought about it before. So yeah, man, I feel like we barely covered the topic though, so definitely we'll have you back. And if you want to come on all the time, I'll make it like a regular feature.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man,
Absolutely.
I'm happen with you and stuff. So
Thanks. I
awesome.
appreciate it.
Seems like everyone enjoyed it, and check Nick out, guys. Give him a follow, and yeah, we'll have you in again. And that's all I really got. I got a store open here. I got 2 minutes to store opening. So
Really appreciate the time.
say growers love. If you got the green thumb, happy growing, and much peace and love. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Appreciate it.
Guys.
Take care. Bye.